and our next speaker is awesome. His name is Jim Diers. He is from the University of Washington. He has a passion for getting people engaged with their communities and in the decisions that affect their lives. Since moving to Seattle in 1976, he put that passion to work for a direct action neighbourhood organisation, a community development corporation, a local foundation, and the nation's largest healthcare cooperative. He was appointed the first director of Seattle's Department of Neighbourhoods in 1988. He now shares the lessons from that work in his courses at the University of Washington, in his work as an international consultant, and in his book Neighbour Power: Building Community the Seattle Way. Jim's contributions have been recognised with an honorary doctorate from Grinnell College, the Public Employer of the Year Award from the Municipal League of Martin Luther King County. Martin Luther King County. How cool is that? Oh my God. And an Innovations Award from the Ford Foundation and the Kennedy School of Government. Please put your hands together for Jim Diers.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Grassroots community organizer, a lifelong community activist, and believe there's absolutely no substitute for community. We need both. But they're two very different paths. Service delivery is done through agencies, whereas community is done through associations. Service delivery, we have different classes of people. We have the professionals, the volunteers, and the clients. In community, we're just all citizens in the largest sense of the word. Service delivery tends to be top-down, whereas community is more democratic. Service delivery tends to focus on people's needs, whereas community tends to focus on people's gifts. Service delivery tends to be one way, whereas community is all about reciprocity and mutual support. Service delivery tends to be siloed, whereas in our communities everything comes together. We get a more holistic perspective. And service delivery, I know with the exception of many people in this room who would come to work regardless, service delivery is totally dependent on money, and community is totally dependent on trust and relationships. And I'm not valuing one over the other. Both are absolutely critical. The problem is over time, we've had more and more and more and more services and less and less and less community. And I'm not one of those Tea Party guys from the United States. I don't think the answer is fewer services. The answer is more community. But it's really tough to get the best of both. Really tough. How many of you know Robert Putnam's work? That's good, more of you don't know. He wrote the most depressing book for those of us who care deeply about community. He's a professor at Harvard University. He did lots of research and tracked the incredible breakdown of community life in North America over the past 50 years. Cites lots of indicators of that. How fewer and fewer people are voting, except in Australia where you still have to, right? Although I was just in Western Australia, they had a dismal turnout for their local elections. How fewer and fewer families are eating dinner together. Fewer and fewer people in the traditional associations like the Rotary and the Bowling Club. So he calls his book Bowling Alone. Cites lots of reasons. I've added some of my own. One is single-purpose land use. Used to be we'd live, learn, work, and play all in the same village. And now we've created single-purpose places, bedroom communities where we go to sleep. We might drive 45 minutes to the mall to shop, and we're losing our main streets. We might commute an hour to work. In a sense, we have many different communities, but in a sense, we have no community at all because we don't bump into the same people over and over again. Increased mobility. Used to be generation after generation, our families would live in the same village. How many people here have moved more than 5 times over the course of your life? Right? And if you're always on the move, it's hard to build relationships. If you know you're going to move again, why bother? It's a lot of work. More time working. Many more women in the workforce than there were 50 years ago, the formal workforce. Good thing, but less time to be involved in community. People working longer and longer hours. Fear has been documented in many places as a key thing breaking down community. Whether or not people have a reason to be afraid, the media makes them really afraid. And they're living behind closed doors. And the more they don't know their neighbors, the more fearful they become. It's kind of fear of the unknown. Electronic screens of all types. Robert Putnam said the biggest thing breaking down our community is television. People say they don't have time for community. You've heard that? And yet they spend an average of 3 or 4 hours a day in front of the television set. And I've been stuck in hotel rooms for the last 2 months. I've watched a little television. I thought, man, if this is our competition and we're losing, come on, it shouldn't be that hard to make community more satisfying, you know, more interesting than television. I think the problem oftentimes is we have forgotten to have fun in our community work. So I love to see that laugh up here. It's great. He wrote this book about 15 years ago, so now I think he would add all those other one-way screens, right? Increasing globalization, where decisions and products are made further and further away from where we live. And the most troubling to me is that the very agencies that are trying to help our communities have inadvertently contributed greatly to the breakdown of the very communities we're trying to help, where we have more and more and more professionals doing for communities what communities often did better for themselves. I recently did a workshop and somebody identified themselves as a joyologist. I thought, oh my God, we've even professionalized joy. And where the strength of every agency is organized into silos with a laser-like focus on their expertise, on their function, on their mission. But it makes it absolutely impossible to work with communities. We have one silo for senior programs and services. We got another one for youth programs and services. We got another one for disabilities. We have another one for new migrants. We got everybody in their own box, and you can't build community in boxes. Sort of a question of who is serving whom, where our communities haven't organized themselves the way the professionals are organized, rather than the professionals being organized the way our communities are organized. So, boy, I've really bummed everybody out. No substitute for community, and it's going down the drain. Actually, I'm really hopeful because when I was in China recently, I was reminded the Chinese word for crisis is made up of 2 characters, one meaning danger and the other meaning opportunity. So with every danger, we have incredible opportunity. The good news right now, we got lots of opportunity. Lots of opportunity. Of course, the downside is we're facing multiple crises. Not just the crisis of our community, but the crisis of our democracy. I was just in Kalamunda. They were doing a funeral for democracy. And really, everywhere I go, there's fewer people voting and more people thinking themselves as taxpayers rather than as citizens. In many ways, our government has done that to us because they have such a focus on customer service at best. The inverse relationship is we think of ourselves only as taxpayers rather than as citizens. And I think people are starting to wake up and realizing we need to take back our democracy. Both local government and communities are starting to realize we need to reinvent democracy. So there's a huge movement right now for participatory democracy. In Brazil, all over Brazil, started in Porto Alegre, they started doing participatory budgeting. At the street level, they identify their priorities and feed those up, and they built the whole city budget from the bottom up. Now participatory budgeting is taking hold all over the world. In the Netherlands, they call the movement Burgerkracht, citizen power. And all over in the Netherlands, people are doing bottom-up planning, all kinds of citizen initiatives. In India, they have village assemblies. In Taiwan, I got to speak at the graduation of hundreds of young people who are graduating as young community planners, leading projects in their communities. In Japan, out of the earthquakes in Kobe came a huge community building movement that continues to this day. In Singapore, young people have organized, and they said, you know, our villages were called kampangs, and that's where we experience community. So they're trying to develop 21st century kampangs, 1 floor at a time, those large high-rises in Singapore. In New Zealand, the movement's called community-led development, largely building on Maori culture, Maori principles, really powerful movement. And here in Australia, every year I get to speak at a Power of the People conference, sponsored by the Municipal Association of Victoria. How refreshing for local government to think that the people might have something to do with our democracy. My friend Peter Kenyon. Yeah. Third crisis we're facing is a crisis of scarcity. I think with the global economic crisis, it all hit us hard, and we had to start doing work in a different way. But even now, our needs are growing much more quickly than the resources to keep up with those needs. And we're starting to recognize that for too long we looked at the wrong map of our communities. We're always focusing on what was missing in our communities. We often say that professionals need needs. Often in our desire to help our communities, the first thing we do is do a needs assessment to figure out what are all the problems. And we're starting to realize that that's the wrong map to be looking at. It's the useless map. What we need to do is start focusing on all those untapped resources in our communities, because that's the basis for growing community. An example of mobilizing those resources, this is in the Lower Hutt, just north of Wellington. Lower income community. There was a woman there named Julia Milne who wanted to start up, she's passionate about gardening. And she saw that the local school had a soccer field that was underutilized. So she talked to the principal and said, could we tear up your soccer field to put it in an urban farm? And they called the project Common Unity, but the whole community came together to build that farm. The kids from the school got involved. They painted the fence posts. They created a food forest. The men's shed used old pokey machine covers to create a greenhouse. They created a rain catchment system. A worm bin. Here's Julia with the worm bin. And because it's New Zealand, they had to build a hobbit house. And it's got a little library inside, you know, with little bookshelves, little tables. Kids love to go in there and read. All made from recycled materials. It has a green roof. And the crops grew, and they realized there was a huge issue with malnutrition in this neighborhood. So some of the parents started working with the kids so that they could start a culinary arts program in the school, and they served that produce in the local school. And these kids who were formerly malnourished now eat fresh, organic meals. And Julia told me it only cost them $10 a day across an entire school to feed all the kids, because most of the produce comes directly from their farm. They started up a honeybee project. Some men who'd had some trouble in their lives came up with a great idea and took old real estate signs and made beehives out of them. And they sell those beehives as a way to make some income, but they also make the most fantastic honey. And they serve that in the school. There were some women, largely migrants, who wanted to start up a sewing cooperative. So in a portable at the school, they started up a sewing cooperative so they could make items for their household and for other households in the community who needed clothing. And there's a huge issue in the neighborhood with rheumatic fever because of the lack of central heating, lack of insulation. So they started up a knitting group. And there were stories about young people who spent a whole year knitting a blanket only to give it away to somebody who needed it more than they did. So they're not only learning about how to knit, they're learning about care. This woman had had a tough life, but she was really passionate about bicycles. So she started up a bicycle library and another portable. And when the kids earn enough hours on the farm, they earn a bicycle. So now every kid in the neighborhood has a bicycle, and she keeps them in great repair. This kid was particularly proud of his bicycle, but it was unsafe. His parents thought it was unsafe to ride his bicycle to school, so he had to walk it to school every day. So he came up with a plan, and he created a plan for a bike path that went around the soccer field. The community got so excited about that, they lobbied the council and said, we'd like to get money to put in the bike path. Council said it's going to cost $25,000. We can't afford it. So the community borrowed a digger, and in one day, they built the bike path themselves. Yeah. And they put in a BMX track. And they had this really cool project called Project Sunshine. And the kids are growing sunflowers. And at the end of the season, they harvest the sunflower heads, they harvest the seeds, they make seed packets, and they send them out to schools all over New Zealand. And these kids that people used to look down on are now so proud. They're the leaders of this project. And they have a sign in that farm that really summarizes to me what community is all about. We have two hands, one for giving and one for receiving. I think a lot of us are really good at giving. We need to recognize that we also need to be good at receiving, because that's what community is all about.
I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Was that the same school? All of this is in one school in New Zealand?
Yeah, it's a school. Yeah, Puni school.
So the unity.
Yeah. The fourth crisis we're facing is the crisis of climate change. And I don't think we're going to make it if it's just about green technology and regulations. We actually need to change the way we live. And I think that will only happen if people feel some sense of connection with each other in the place they share. Otherwise, what difference does it make if I don't recycle? What difference does it make if I waste energy? I'm one person on this huge planet, but it's in community we feel some sense of accountability, some sense of responsibility, some sense that collectively our actions will make a difference. This is a quick story from one of our neighborhoods in Seattle. Seattle has about 720,000 people, but we're made up of neighborhoods. So the neighborhoods are more like 5,000 people. And one of those neighborhoods is Ballard, and they applied for some matching funds. We have a program in the Department of Neighborhoods called the Neighborhood Matching Fund, where we provide a cash match from local government in exchange for the community's equal match of volunteer labor in support of community-initiated projects. There have been more than 5,000 projects completed over the last 28 years. Tens of thousands of neighbors making those projects possible. Don't worry, I'm not going to share all the projects, but I want to share one. So Ballard was a neighborhood of Seattle that had the least number of street trees of any neighborhood in Seattle. They also had the least number of parks of any neighborhood outside of downtown Seattle. There was one woman named Dervilla Gowan who cared passionately about trees. She wanted to see trees up and down the streets. So she put notices in her church bulletin. She put notices in the corner grocery store. She put them in the Ballard News Tribune, trying to find other people who shared her passion for street trees. And Dervilla tried to find somebody at every block of Ballard who shared her passion. And if nobody came forward from that block, she'd go to that block and knock on every door till she convinced somebody they shared her passion for street trees. And then she got that person to sign a pledge form saying, I'll come to a training about how to plant and take care of the trees. I'll recruit my neighbors to do the same thing. She turned in all of her matching fund, she turned in all of her pledge forms with her matching fund application, and one day trucks came into her neighborhood with 1,080 trees. They dropped them off in every block in Ballard. Dervilla knocked on the door of the block captain and said, the trees are here. Block captain knocked on the neighbors' doors. That day, over 1,000 people came out and planted trees up and down the streets. People felt incredibly empowered. Beginning of the day, there were no street trees. At the end of the day, they had tree-lined streets. Look what we can do when we work together as a community. They said, well, this is fantastic, but we still have the least number of parks of any neighborhood in Seattle. So they walked around the neighborhood looking for potential park sites and had a hard time finding them because the neighborhood is pretty developed. But they finally found this old rundown house. It used to serve as a nursery. Property was overgrown, big public safety problem right next to the business district. Convinced the city to buy that property for a park. Our city had some open space bond money to buy the property, but absolutely no money to design or build the park. So the neighbors did it themselves. Local landscape architect volunteered her services and worked with the other neighbors. Together they designed and built Baker Park, all with volunteers. This is the entranceway into the park. This is some of the landscaping. There were some beautiful trees in the park, and one of them had died. And they're trying to figure out how to remove it. And then one of the neighbors, who was Native American, had a better idea and carved it in place as a totem. And here's some of the detail. Kind of a bear with a frog in his mouth, kind of a symbol of returning nature to the city. The group went on the next year, and they tore up all the asphalt around the local school. They called it a Gray to Green project. Much better for the kids in the neighborhood and the school because they have a green place to play. Much better for the environment because the water can percolate through the soil rather than having instant runoff. We now do it around all our schools in Seattle, but it's the kind of innovation that's more likely to come out of the community than out of the bureaucracy. This is the opening day when we had the celebration, and the local marching band showed up to play. They're called the Sedentary Sousa Band. It's a marching band that only plays while sitting down. This is a property in the neighborhood that was platted as a street, owned by our transportation department. There's houses on either side, but it was never developed because it's too steep. Cars could never make it to the top. So as a result, the property just became overgrown, became a huge problem with rats. The only thing that tried to go up were four-wheel drive vehicles. They challenge each other, race their engines, and challenge each other to make it to the top, driving the neighbors totally crazy. I thought the neighbors were crazy because they went out with picks and shovels, dug through that heavy hard-pan clay soil by hand, hauled those timbers up the side, terraced that whole problem hillside, and turned that problem property into a community garden. This is now one of more than 100 organic community gardens we have in the city of Seattle, 10,000 urban gardeners, and collectively they donate 3 tons of organic produce to our food banks every year. This is the group's most recent project. This is the site of another former house, so to commemorate the house, they built all the furniture out of cement. And at the dedication of this park, they unveiled a timeline that shows the 20 parks they built over the past 20 years. Every one of them with volunteers. They built ball fields. They built playgrounds. They've renaturalized natural areas. They worked with the kids to build a skate park. They are restoring a salmon estuary on Puget Sound. 20 parks in 20 years, all volunteer, one neighborhood. They said, well, this is great. We've made our neighborhood a much better place. We're concerned about what's happening to the planet. We're concerned about climate change. So they organized an all-volunteer group called Sustainable Ballard. And every summer for the past 13 years now, they've had a Sustainable Ballard Fest in the local park. And they have food and music to bring people in. And they have booths to educate neighbors about what they can do to reduce their carbon footprint. And the first booth you go to is the undriver's license station, where you go and check all the ways you will not drive over the next month. And when you do, you get a laminated undriver's license. It looks just like my official Washington State driver's license. Julia Fields is the one who organized it. She says, I'm going to walk, I'm going to bike, I'm going to take transit. When you get your driver's license, it tells you to drive the shuffle bus. This is like a Fred Flintstone-mobile, pedaled by feet, going down the streets of Ballard, gets everybody's attention, gets people thinking, what could I do to get out of my car? What could I do to reduce my carbon footprint? This has created a movement now. All the neighborhoods around Ballard have organized their own all-volunteer sustainability groups. All the suburban communities around Seattle have done the same. We now have 67 of these all-volunteer organizations, and collectively they call themselves Scallops, Sustainable Communities All Over Puget Sound. And it all started with the Villa Gowan and those street trees 20 years ago. There is incredible untapped potential in our communities. It's got to start small, but it can grow really big. And I think it's got to. Fifth crisis is the crisis of intolerance. We're facing that more and more in my country right now. Huge, huge, huge divides in our country. And I think communities, particularly neighborhoods, are the opportunity to start bridging those divides that we have. If you think about it, every kind of community except for a place-based community is one kind of people. There's communities of interest, there's communities of identity. It's in our neighborhoods that we have the potential to bring diverse people together. People from different religions, people from different politics, people with different interests, people with different cultures, all in the same place. And to start to get to know each other, to build those relationships. This is back in the Lower Hutt, New Zealand. This is a story that happened earlier this month. There was a Syrian refugee who had started up a nursery as a way to kind of help support this Common Unity project. Vandals came in the middle of the night and destroyed all of his plants. 4 days later, 600 volunteers came out to help him rebuild that nursery. People came with plants. They came with potting soil. And then did a work party where they all worked together to replant those plants. People brought foods to feed everybody. Musician played while people worked. But that's the power of community. When Donald Trump issued his immigration order, that very day in Seattle, 10,000 people spontaneously showed up at SeaTac Airport to protest and shut down the airport because they wanted to keep their neighbors. I'm losing track. This is about sixth crisis of inequality, increasing income gaps. And I think we need to remember the unique power of community to restore social justice. No major social change in my country has ever come top down. I think the same is true in Australia. Our civil rights movement, our women's rights movement, our disability rights movement, our gay, lesbian rights movement, our environmental movement, our peace movement. Every major social change has come bottom up. So without strong communities, we can't make change. It's a story from East London. East London has a high percentage of migrants working low-wage jobs, working hard, not making enough money to actually live in East London. So they started up a campaign where all the churches and the mosques joined forces together to demand that every employer pay a living wage. And they went after the hospital, they went after the university, they went after the chain stores, they went after the big box retail. Finally, the City of London, and one at a time they got them to sign contracts saying, we will agree to pay a living wage. And this is why they have power. Look at the numbers they can turn out when they bring everybody together. And when the Olympics were going to come to London, they said, we will not support the Olympic bid unless you agree to pay everybody involved in the Olympics a living wage. And so everybody got paid a living wage, the construction workers, the janitors. And when the Olympics were done, a good share of the Olympic Village was turned back to the community as permanently affordable housing. That's the power of community. But Margaret Wheatley said, whatever the question, community is the answer. It's also the answer to preventing crime. Again, you need professionals. You don't want communities making up their own laws, enforcing their own laws. That's a job for police. But when it comes to preventing crime, there's absolutely no substitute for community. We spend way too many resources lining up the ambulances at the bottom of the cliff when community's job is to build the fence at the top. My country, every year we spend more and more money in so-called public safety programs, and every year we have more people behind bars and people aren't feeling any more safe. We forgot about the role of community. It drives me crazy when people complain about the local youth problem. It's like, whose youth are they? And who's in a better position to raise the young people than their families and their neighbors? Responding to disaster. Christchurch is our sister city. Leanne Dalzell, mayor of Christchurch, told me the number one lesson they learned from those earthquakes, yes, it's important to have the emergency plans, yes, it's important to have the emergency supplies, but there's nothing more important than knowing your neighbors. Because when those earthquakes came, all the emergency crews went to the central city. Suburbs that were heavily hit, like Brighton, Sumner, Littleton, were totally dependent on their neighbors. Promoting health. Studies show that again, there's a role for professionals. You don't want your neighbor to do your surgery, right? Unless your neighbor's a surgeon, right? But when it comes to promoting health, I think there's no substitute for community. Studies show that only about 15% of health outcomes can actually be attributed to healthcare professionals. And that in many ways, our communities can have a much bigger impact on our health, on our mental health, on the behaviors that influence our health, and on the social determinants of health. Lots of studies show the biggest things impacting our health are things like our economic situation, our physical environment, our natural environment, all of which can be better influenced by community than by healthcare professionals. Creating great places, sustaining the local economy, instilling happiness, all dependent on strong communities. So, how do we grow community? I want to talk about the key shifts that we need to make in order to bring back more community. And the first one is to move from volunteers and clients to thinking of ourselves as citizens. The meaning of community, the root words for community come from meaning among one another, and munus meaning gifts. So community really means sharing our gifts with one another. And to recognize that absolutely everybody in our community has gifts to give. I like to think of them as three kinds of gifts. Gifts of the head, that person's knowledge. Gifts of the heart, that person's passions. And gifts of the hands, that person's skills. Absolutely everybody has these. But the problem in our society is that we have labeled most people not by their gifts, but by their needs. And we're just focusing on what people are missing. They become clients in a service system. We focus on people's gifts. They become citizens in our community. And I'm not denying that people have needs, people require services. Everybody in this room has some needs. Everybody in this room requires some services. But I think most people in this room would be identified primarily by your gifts, and most people outside this room would be identified primarily by their needs. And then we wonder why all those individuals aren't active in our community. It's because we have defined them out of community. We've defined them as clients rather than as citizens. Do you all know the story about stone soup? No. Quick version. It was right after the war, and soldiers are coming through the countryside, and they're really hungry. So they get to this little village, and they ask the villagers, do you have some food you can spare? And the villagers say, sorry, we don't have anything, because they've hoarded what little food they have. Soldiers say, that's okay, because we got a magic stone. If somebody lend us a kettle, we'll make stone soup. So a villager brings a kettle, they put the water in, they add the stone, they put it on the fire. The soup is going to be fantastic. But you know, it would be even better if somebody could give us a few herbs. So a villager brings a few. Somebody else brings a leek. Somebody else brings a carrot. Somebody else brought a few scraps of meat. Every villager brought a little something. And when that soup was done, people were blown away. They'd never had such delicious soup before. And they marveled at the magic of that stone. But of course, the moral of the story is the magic isn't in the stone, the magic is in community. To me, that's the meaning of community, recognizing no one person has all the gifts to build community, but collectively we have everything we need to do really powerful community work. But again, our gifts have been buried under labels like unemployed, poor person, single parent, addict, offender, non-English speaking, disabled, old person, at-risk youth, homeless, etc., etc., etc. So just want to talk about the power of lifting off those labels and focusing on the gifts that everybody has. So I've got a friend, Damon Lynch, who's a minister in a church in Cincinnati, Ohio. Members of his church operate a soup kitchen in the basement for homeless men. Finally, somebody got this idea, says, why don't we interview the men, find out what their gifts are? Turns out a whole bunch of these men like to cook. They said, would you like to help cook the meals in the soup kitchen? They were overjoyed. Nobody ever thought to ask them that before. And after a while, the homeless men and the members of the church are cooking and eating together. And it was kind of hard to tell who were the providers and who were the clients, because it wasn't about services anymore. It's about community. And to me, that's the meaning of community, recognizing every one of us has gifts and every one of us has needs. It's about supporting each other's needs with each other's gifts. Another label that drives me crazy is at-risk youth. We hardly ever talk about young people anymore without that adjective, at risk. And there's some truth to every one of these labels, but it's only part of the truth. And to lift off that label, who's got more energy than young people? Who's got more creativity than young people? Who understands technology better than young people? Who's got more at stake in the future of our community than young people? Who are the experts on young people more than young people? And then we sit around and talk about the youth problem. We don't have a youth problem. Our problem is we aren't engaging the gifts of young people. This is in our Soto area, warehouse and industrial area, just south of downtown Seattle. I wish I had the before picture, because the backs of the warehouses were covered with graffiti. There was garbage all along the tracks. And it's the first view that commuters and tourists get of Seattle each day, because it's how our light rail comes in. It looks terrible. Mike Perringer here worked in the local factory. He was embarrassed about this image of his neighborhood, and Mike had a great idea. He says, why don't we see the backs of the warehouses as potential canvases for murals? He called it the Urban Art Corridor. But Mike had an even better idea. He worked with our court system, and he asked the judges, could you offer the kids who get busted for graffiti an alternative sentence where they could come and help us to create the murals? Not an easy decision for the kids, because it's like a job. You had to show up at work on time, you had to dress appropriately, you got life skills training, mentored by professional artists. But young people create every one of these murals. And we found that as long as the kids were involved in this program, not one of them reoffended. The problem in Seattle is you can only paint outdoor murals 3 months a year because it's raining the other 9 months. So Mike came up with another great idea and got a local warehouse to donate their space. And in there, they create murals on 4x8 sheets of plywood. They put those around construction sites to beautify the construction sites. The developers pay for the murals, and it keeps the program sustainable over time. So now more than 1,500 murals have been created through this program, and more than 5,000 young people have participated. And you don't have to get busted to get into the program. We don't want to create negative incentives. Story from Adelaide. When I was first here, about 10 years ago, I think it was, I met Barb, who is a social worker with United Care. And she shared this story with me about one of her clients whose name was Colleen. And Colleen was a woman who was totally depressed, and depressed for good reason, because she had lost her husband and her best friend and her dog. There was nobody left in her life who she thought cared deeply about her or who she felt close to herself. So she'd just given up. She was just laying in bed day after day, depressed. Barb came to see her one day and saw this knitting by the side of her bed. Said, "That's kind of cool. What is it?" Colleen said, "That's a tea cozy. I made it years ago." Well, Barb knew there's a new tea shop going in Adelaide. She talked to the owners and said, "Do you think you could sell some of these?" They said, "Oh my God, we've been looking over for good tea cozies. Yeah, we could sell those." So she went back and told Colleen. Colleen got a little bit excited. She started making more and more tea cozies. They started flying off the shelves of the tea shop. She couldn't keep up with demand. So Colleen reached out to other older women who were in her same situation. And taught them how to make tea cozies. They formed the Cozy Club. And they really didn't need the proceeds from these tea cozies, so they used all the proceeds to support an association of women with acquired brain injuries. And they started involving these women in the Cozy Club. And they made more and more tea cozies and wonderful fabric wall hangings like this one showing a winery right outside of Adelaide. I was back in Adelaide a few years later, and I ran into Barb. She came running up to me and said, "Jim, we just bought this old caravan, and now we got it at the men's shed, and we're going to get outfitted with a spout and a handle." And they call it Colleen. And they pull this from neighborhood to neighborhood. And inside they have the capacity to make tea. And all the neighbors gather around and drink tea together and talk about what they could do to make their neighborhood a better place. And as they're talking, they're knitting. And they add to the tea cozy that now surrounds Colleen. Yeah, best stories are from your own community. Yeah. Another label that drives me crazy is non-English speaking, where we define new immigrants and refugees by the one language they don't know. Right? Just think how helpful that could be in our community work if we focused on all the languages they do know. Well, we found that we had a huge issue in our community because we had lack of access for refugees to healthcare services, and particularly culturally appropriate healthcare services. And somebody found, 5 minutes? I got started about a half hour late. Particularly culturally appropriate healthcare services. So they started up, what they recognized was that a lot of people who were working in restaurants or working as taxi drivers had healthcare backgrounds. And so they started up a program at our community college where they do a little bit of triage and figure out what kind of support do they need so they can get certified as healthcare workers. And it's usually just a little bit of English as a second language in a health context, right? Much better wages for these people and much better access to health services for everybody else. Oh boy, what am I going to skip? Oh, this is developmentally disabled is the one that really drives me crazy, that label. You know, how many people in this room have no disability? I see some eyeglasses. My disability is my memory, gets worse every year. We all have some disability. And yet there's a growing section of our population we think of solely in terms of their disability, and we miss out on all their gifts. So this is a story from Seattle where we tried to help neighborhood associations think about how they could be stronger if they were more inclusive. So Matt here and his mom came to see me, and Matt says, "I've been living in the Ravenna neighborhood now for 9 years. I don't know anybody." I said, "Matt, what do you like about your neighborhood?" He said, "I love Ravenna Creek." And they took me to the creek. I knew the neighbors were working hard to clean up the creek to make better salmon habitat. So I talked to Thomas, who was head of the association. I said, "Thomas, could you involve Matt in your project?" He said, "Yeah, we can always use more volunteers." So I trained Matt how to remove the invasive holly and how to reforest with native plants. And it wasn't long before Matt became the expert. He was leading all the work parties. But Matt's greatest gift, he's got this incredibly, whoa, what happened? He has this incredibly infectious personality, and he knocks on your door, he says, "Hi, I'm Matt. I really care about the salmon, don't you? You're going to help me, aren't you?" You can't say no to Matt. He is the #1 volunteer recruiter in the neighborhood. He's got armies of people cleaning out that invasive holly. And he's incredibly creative. At Christmas time, he organizes a holly day party. And all the neighbors go and they collect that invasive holly and they come back and make Christmas decorations. And then he invites everybody back to his house for a big party. Matt is totally socially uninhibited, so he's always the first one out on the dance floor. He helps everybody else break out of their shells. That's his gift. He builds community like nobody else. I got to fly through these here. Darn. The second one is moving from programs and services to mutual support. That's the second major shift we need to make. Senior services of King County.
8 minutes, how's that?
5 minutes now. Good, just keep adding them. Keep adding them. That's good. So King County is the next layer up from the city of Seattle. Huge geographic area, including urban cities like Seattle and small rural towns. And Senior Services is responsible for all the senior centers and all the programs like Meals on Wheels. Denise Klein is the head of Senior Services, and she came to me and said, Jim, we got a terrible problem. Our population is quickly aging, and our budget is being cut every year. So our needs are going like this, the resources like this, we got to do work in a new way. So we organized a program we called Aging Your Way. And we had gatherings in small towns and urban neighborhoods all over King County. Had about 100 people at each one, boomers and older people. And Denise started off with a really good exercise. She asked people, close your eyes and think about when you are first old. So here people, and it really shook up people like me who've never wanted to think about being old before. For the first time, what's it like? What am I contributing? What do I need? How am I fitting into my neighborhood? So here people are reflecting on that question. That was Denise. I love this woman's expression. She's not quite sure she wants to go there. This guy's kind of having fun with it. Then when people are in that frame of mind, I asked them to have a conversation around their table about what would your neighborhood or town need to be like physically and socially to allow you to age in the way you would like. What would a senior-friendly community look like? And then I gave each table 20 minutes to collectively draw their vision. And then each table got a minute to present their vision back to the room as a whole. And then I had a graphic artist who took all of those and created a composite vision for each town or each neighborhood. And she had a pretty easy job because the themes were so similar from one table to the next. Here's what we heard. We have spent a whole lifetime getting skills and knowledge and building relationships. And now we are just valued for our needs. We're just valued as clients. We want the opportunity to contribute. Second thing we heard. Right now in senior services, all we see is a bunch of old people. It is so boring. We want to be able to interact with young people, but they're in a separate set of programs and services. Third thing we heard, we spent a whole lifetime screwing up the environment. We want to give back. We want to live in a place that's green, that's sustainable. And a fourth thing we heard, right now, every stage of our life, we have to move to a different place. We want to be able to age around the people we know and love, in the places with which we are familiar. So we want universal design. We want pedestrian-friendly communities. We want good access to services. We want good transportation options. Not one of these things was being addressed by senior services. Shows the importance of, instead of always out there delivering our programs and services, the importance of listening to what's important to the community. So I said, you know what happens then, right? We get all these great ideas about things that move towards this vision, and then everybody gets their dots, right? Have you done that? And you put your dots on your favorite ideas. Then at the end of the workshop, we count up the number of dots, and then we put it in a planning document, and then we put it in a file, and then we never see it again. Have you been there? And then we wonder why people don't get engaged in the process. They never see any connection between their participation and results. We're always creating lists of things for somebody to do. Oh, good, I still have 5 minutes. Good. We're always creating lists for somebody to do, but nobody's taking responsibility. So we said, we're really clear. We said, nothing's going to happen unless you take responsibility for it. So if you like any of these ideas, you're going to have to get people to join you and start working on it. So here's what happened. One group came to organize, a group of seniors who like to do regular walks, organized a walking map of their favorite routes to encourage other seniors to do the same thing. We had a group of seniors in West Seattle who started up a senior dating service. Something that never would have come out of senior services, but was obviously an unmet need in the neighborhood. We, 3 different groups are planning for senior co-housing. We organized 3 virtual retirement villages where neighbors are helping elders stay in their homes by taking care of their yards, their houses, giving them rights to doctor's appointments, to the grocery store. We organized a whole series of gatherings out of a gay-lesbian gathering. They had a whole bunch of projects. Just about every group wanted to have opportunities for lifelong learning, so they worked together to create a website to identify the existing opportunities. Young people worked with the seniors at the local school to create a trail through the woods and do maintenance parties every weekend, learn about nature together. We started up 5 time banks where young people and elders are supporting each other with their gifts. In my old neighborhood of Columbia City, somebody said, you know, our strength is we have many different cultures. I want to organize a world dance party. So one night, we had people show up from 12 different cultures to teach each other their dance. We learned 12 different kinds of dance, and we had people there from absolutely every generation, from this older woman to this little girl. She was our DJ. It was so much fun that now we do it every month. Hundreds of people show up, and we're always learning new kinds of dance. And it's all organized by neighbors. I'm going to skip over this. I hate to do this. Oh, this is a neighborhood house one, too. Oh. So I got to wrap up. So the final one, I think the final shift we need to make is that too oftentimes we're measuring the wrong thing. You know, we're all held accountable for the work we do, but so oftentimes we're counting things that really, we're spending so many resources counting things when those resources could really be spent to actually doing good in people's lives. I grew up in Iowa, so I love the Iowa farm proverb. You don't make the hog fatter by weighing it. You know, just measuring it itself doesn't necessarily have value. And I love what Einstein says, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. We're often counting the wrong things just because they're easy. I love what they did in Port Phillip. They kind of figured it out. They said, you know, the only thing that really matters is whether people are happy. Think about it. What else is important? So they trained volunteers how to be smile spies. And they walk down the street and they capture other people's eyes and they see what percentage of people smile back at them. And they've worked out a formula where they calculate how many smiles per hour are in each neighborhood. And then they post traffic signs showing how many smiles per hour in that neighborhood. So this is, they're at 7 in this neighborhood. Luna Park, they're up to 10. And the numbers just keep going up. It's the only indicator I've seen that's actually changing conditions, because no neighborhood wants to be seen as unfriendly. This guy's really happy. He's up to 14. So I just want to conclude by saying thank you for everything you do to put smiles on the faces of people in South Australia. Yeah, I just think there's no more important work than what you're doing right now because of all the crises we're facing. Community is the answer, and you are doing absolutely the most important work. And I know sometimes it's really hard work. Sometimes we wonder, what difference are we making, because these issues are overwhelming, and what difference am I making on the global scene? But what gives me hope is I am working in 17 different countries, and everywhere, very different countries. And every place I go, there are people like you who are working passionately to make their communities a better place. And that's what gives me hope, is that we aren't alone. You are part of a global movement. People everywhere are working hard to make their communities healthy, to make this world a better place. So thank you so much for what you do.